Well, hello. I'm so excited to be back at Berkeley. I graduated in '99 from Berkeley, and I graduated from Haas from the full-time MBA program. So I'm just delighted to be back and have the opportunity to talk about international development and the United States with all of you. Before we start, I just want to make it clear that we want this to be interactive. So if you have any questions, please send them in, or comments or anything you want to share, please send them in and we'll respond in real time. So please do. And also let us know where you're listening in from, so we can maybe customize some of the comments here today. So thank you again. Wanted to talk a little bit about the future of development. I currently work in Washington, D.C., where I work for a company called Tetra. We do a lot of international development work. We have projects in 130 countries that range from water and roads to energy and telecom and countering violent extremism. So we have a kind of an insight into what's happening now on the ground. So I wanted to share a bit about that. What we are seeing is that the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. So we have innovations that are happening here in the Bay Area that are just amazing, but they can be like a world away from the realities of people on the ground. And I really think about the role of international development as closing that and distributing the future more closely. One of the issues that I think underpins international development is electricity. We are doing a lot of work from where I sit now on promoting energy access in developing countries. And that's because more than 1 billion people still don't have energy access. It's like the precursor for modernity. You need energy for industrialization. So kind of thinking about how that works, and you can see kind of on the slide that there's this large swath that's dark in the middle, where Africa is dark, and it's not just because there's a large landmass. There's actually, it should be 4 times brighter in Africa than the United States, but it's not. And so it's really important to think about connecting the world so that we can all share the future. The other thing that we're spending time on is on internet access. So you have 1 billion people without energy, but you have more than 4 billion people without internet access. And as we think about developments here, if we don't connect those people, they will be completely missing the boat. And one of the challenges is to not just assume that it'll just happen naturally. I mean, electricity started 100 years ago, and still 1 billion people aren't. So we need to think from the onset of why people don't have internet access and how we can address it. One of the shocking things about internet access is that the digital gender divide, the number of women versus men online, is actually widening. You have more men getting online than women, and it's getting worse and worse every year. Right now, there's 250 more men online, 250 million more men online than women. And that's a challenge that we need to really face head on as we think about internet access. When we think about what I also wanted to show with this slide is like thinking about the intersection of energy and internet and telecom. You know, this is a picture from the One campaign that advocates for international development of a doctor using a cell phone to light a patient in the dark. You know, when you have hospitals trying to provide care without energy access, it's a really huge challenge that affects the rest of the development cycle, whether it's health or education or countering violent extremism. We see this kind of like as from the Industrial Revolution perspective, that we had steam and water, then we had electricity, we had, you know, what happened in IT, and now we're looking at the fourth Industrial Revolution, this like merging of cyber physical. And one thing I hope that we all keep in mind as we think about international development and what's happening in tech is that we model things for the rest of the world. So that when we're thinking about artificial intelligence, that we're addressing biases that when we're developing it here or in California or in DC, that it's applicable then to the developing world, and along with the other types of technology. Because this is really, we're in just a transformative time, and we need to be careful we don't leave people behind. Switching to the US, we're at a critical moment in international development. So the United States and the other donors spend money in a bilateral basis, straight from the US government to fund development projects, and also through the development banks, like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the other regional development banks. And there was some concern when the Trump administration started with this America First plan that funding to development would be cut. That concern became great when the budget first came out. The budget was proposed from the Trump administration to cut foreign assistance by over 30%. But what we've seen is some change with that. We had Secretary Tillerson really emphasize that there was opportunity through USAID to advance US interests through development, our humanitarian, our economic, and our security interests. And then when the budget went to Congress, we had it was a moment to remember that Congress is the one who really decides the budget. The Congress has the power of the purse. And Congress thoroughly rejected the cuts for development spending. So we are looking at a budget cycle where we're expecting development spending to continue on, and you're seeing continued emphasis from Congress of their support for development. On this slide, we have a couple quotes from a Democrat senator and Republican senator that both are leaders in Congress, really stressing how much development matters for our national security. And so we're certainly hopeful that that continues. What you can see is that, development spending has been about $60 billion. The request from the administration was $40 billion, and now we're expecting the House and the Senate to come up with numbers either in a continuing resolution or in actual appropriations that are higher. But what matters more than aid is really the financial flows. So what we're seeing is that 90% of the money that's going to developing countries is actually coming from the private sector. So we're at a point now where we really need to think about how do we direct private sector funds to development projects that really make sense and have impact on the ground, and magnify what the US is doing rather than having it just spend into a vacuum. So there are different organizations that are thinking about that. Bretton Woods 2, an initiative in the New America, is thinking about how do you get pension fund money to go to development projects. And it's not to just do good and save the world, it's really thinking about, for the pensions, how do they reduce their financial risk on their overall portfolio. So if they're investing in development and then they have other investments in that country, in those countries or those regions, their overall risk would go down, and their pensioners or their investors would make more money. So it's a really exciting time to think about how do we kind of move forward, not just with bilateral aid, and to also think about what we do differently with the development banks. It was kind of missed in President Trump's speech. It didn't get a lot of coverage, but it was really interesting that in his speech in Asia recently, he talked about reform of the development finance institutions in the United States and looking toward how to use them more efficiently. So in addition to USAID, the United States has OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, EXIM, and a Development Credit Authority within USAID, a bunch of different tools that do development finance. And so we're at this really interesting opportunity or moment where we can think about how do we leverage those things? Does it make sense to merge them or have them work closely together? Are there different tools that they need to have in this new world? Maybe it's equity authority and not just debt investment. And also to think about what we do with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. The Millennium Challenge Corporation was started during the Bush administration, and it provides grant financing to countries that are good performers on certain indicators that range from corruption to girls' education. So we're at this moment of thinking also about what do we do with the Millennium Challenge Corporation and differently now that it's been around for a while and has run through the initial set of countries that qualified. It has a few more left, but that pool of countries is shrinking. So I would again encourage anyone to send in their questions. We will go through them in order and let us know where they're from, and then we can go through that. And before we go on further, so send those in. And we also have students in the room. We're very excited to have that, so they're welcome to pipe in with any questions they might have.
Thanks so much for being here. I guess one of my questions is how we can, we're definitely shifting away from sort of the traditional donor model, where places like Packard and Gates really set the agenda. But I think one of the frustrations I felt as someone who comes from an international development role and plan to go back into the international development space after Haas is that there's an unwillingness from donors to fund things like infrastructure or human resources. And there's much more focus on sort of like either products or medicines or programs. And I think that oftentimes the success of those products and programs is dependent on the foundations upon which they're built, including like national infrastructure and human resources, people with education and training to be able to implement those things. And so I know a lot of grant money cannot be used for things like paying salaries of community health workers or doctors or things like that. And so I'm curious to know how you think we can either start to shift that mindset among donors, or if sort of the traditional donors are not the ones to fund infrastructure development, who is? Is that where the private sector comes in?
So thank you very much for the question. The question was really, it was kind of delving into how do we get the donors to fund programs and not just the health and products? And how do we get them to think about the infrastructure piece as well? When I worked for Congress, I had the honor of working for Chairman Royce, who is the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And we wrote the Electrify Africa Act that helps promote energy to developing countries, which is really an infrastructure bill. And we came to it from looking at trade, where we did a bipartisan trip to Africa, looking at why trade preferences weren't being used evenly. And we realized it was because they didn't have electricity. And without electricity, you can't make the quality and quantity for the US market. So we wrote the Electrify Africa Act, sent it to the White House during the Obama administration, and they said, oh, we're thinking about the same thing. And we launched the Power Africa initiative. And what's been really interesting about that is that it's thinking about how do you crowd in the private sector into infrastructure projects. So you can have the governments and the donors supporting maybe feasibility studies, supporting transaction advisors who can knock heads and help make things happen. But it's really creating tools to get the private sector to get into the infrastructure projects that make the most sense. So we have a tool, the Power Africa Transaction Tracker. It's available on your local app store. And you can look at all of the transactions that are being funded through Power Africa or being observed by Power Africa in Africa, and see what the stage is, and the private sector and other donors can look and see where else that they can slot in. I do think that there's a huge opportunity there to like take that idea and branch it out into broad infrastructure. Like, where else is the U.S. funding infrastructure projects? To do a transaction tracker for that, to allow the other donors or the private sector to know which ones kind of have the imprimatur of the U.S. that we've done this analysis and determined that we think this is a really important tool. So I think that that's one way. The other is to have the donors like to do things that they can have measurable results, and then they can get credit for it. And it's hard for them to fund kind of ongoing programming, because it's like a number of salaried employees doesn't look great in a program. What I would suggest is that we think about how to lift countries up so it's actually they're financially sustainable. People often use the word sustainability in terms of environment, but when you think about financially, the way to get a developing country to fund their own infrastructure is just to have donors focus more on domestic resource mobilization. That's a long way of saying the kind of what can be a bad word in development, which is taxes. So how do you increase the tax base for countries so that they can fund themselves? If you look at a lot of developing countries, the largest the tax base is really multinational companies. It's not people who are living in the country. And when you don't have an adequate tax base, it undermines democracy, because the governments aren't really accountable to their people. They're accountable to either big corporations or their donors. I mean, there's some countries where if you add donors and multinationals, it's more than 90% of their government funding is coming from those sources. So thinking about like domestic resource mobilization as something that donors should fund, it hasn't been like a focus of anything. And that way we can get countries to fund their own stuff so that they can fund their own infrastructure, they can fund healthcare on their own, and get out of this cycle of dependency. Because what I think our goal should be is that we work our way out of development as a job, and that we can look toward more partnership. And while we wait on the next question, I wanted to share a quote from the Secretary of Defense that kind of shows the importance of development to the United States. It's, if you don't fully fund the State Department, I need to buy more ammunition. And I think it shows you really how critical this is, not just for trade and development, but really to think about the safety and security of our country, that this stuff, the State Department foreign policy role and the foreign aid role really matters. And it's a particularly challenging time, right? So last year, 20 people were driven out of their homes every single minute. So you have now more than 65 million people that are displaced. You have 20 million people that are at risk of starvation. Like, these are really fundamental things that we need to address as a society so that we can all be safe together on this planet. If we don't figure out how to deal with these issues now, it could undermine a lot of the growth and opportunity that we see for ourselves.
I have a question. Thank you so much for being here. Since we have such an international Haas community, I wonder if you could share maybe some models that other countries are using in approaching development that might differ from what the U.S. has been doing.
That is a great question. So the question is, what other bilateral donors are doing development differently? So the one that first comes to mind is China. China's doing development really differently, and it has people in U.S. policy circles kind of on edge. Because rather than giving to nonprofits or funding specific programs, China is funding big projects and they are bringing in their teams of people to help build it. And they're doing a lot of economic partnership with countries. And there's not a lot of clarity on the numbers. They're not reported through the typical development aid systems. So there's some concern about how much of that is grant and how much of that is a loan, and are countries getting indebted. We had previously, we had this thing called HIPC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which provided debt relief to a lot of poor countries. So the US and other donors through the Paris Club provided debt relief, along with the IMF and World Bank and the other regional development banks. So now we are worried that countries are going back in debt. And we are also worried about tied aid, that China is requiring certain trade relationships in exchange for that aid. So it's a really different model that's, I guess some people call mercantilist. So it's completely different. In the UK, they used to be more like the US in how they did aid, but they have a new way of doing aid called through their Prosperity Fund, where they're looking at doing projects that are very connected to UK businesses, business interests. And we tend not to do it. Our development structures have traditionally been more about what is the development impact in that country, and those are the metrics that we used. We tended not to use how many US companies benefited to it, so that's pretty unusual or different. And then you have the other big kind of donors in the space are Australia, which currently is doing more in our age. What is different about the UK and or different about Canada and Australia is that they merged their aid agencies with their foreign policy agencies. So in the United States, we have state and aid separate, and in Canada and Australia, they're merged. And so there's a lot of debate on what makes sense. In the US, that came up at the beginning of the Trump administration, where there was indications that the administration was thinking about folding USAID and state together. And there was a major uproar in the development community. We did not want to see that happen. We were really worried that development interests would get subsumed. Because development interests tend to be more long-term, and foreign policy interests tend to be a little bit more short-term. And so the Center for Strategic and International Studies had a task force. I was one of the members, and we recommended that state and aid not be merged, that they be held separate. The administration has then taken on that recommendation and recently testified that they don't plan to merge it. So we're not expected to go in the same direction as Canada and Australia, at least this time around. Sorry. I think we have a question in the room.
I have a question on the funding of technology. One of the concerns of the developing countries is that most of the funding ends up in infrastructure, as we said, in medicine or food. But there is very little funding into IT or more modern industries. The concern there is that there's going to be a brain drain, and as soon as the economies start developing, most of the most talented people basically end up leaving the country, thus delaying the development. What's your view on that, and what is the US doing to help promote that kind of development?
So that's a great question. The question is, how is the US addressing technology and development, especially to avoid a potential brain drain? When I worked for Chairman Rice, I had the chance to write for him the Digital Gap Act that promotes internet access in developing countries. It's passed the House of Representatives twice, and we're hoping that it will pass the Senate in this cycle. And it promotes internet access in developing countries. As you know, most of the internet is funded through the private sector. And what we're seeing is that when the United States or the other development banks are funding infrastructure, they fund it as though it's just roads or just water, and it's not integrated. And what the bill does is it calls on, it makes it our policy, to integrate internet or connectivity solutions into our infrastructure unless there's some reason that it shouldn't be. More than 90% of laying cable is digging up the road and putting it back down. And the United States has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on roads with not a single mile of cable under it. I mean, it's just shameful. So, and that I went to Tanzania when I worked for the Senate to do oversight of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and we put in thousands of miles of road right after the underwater cable came into Dar es Salaam, and not 1 mile has cable under it. And I was telling someone that story, and he was like, I have a worse story. And he was talking about Liberia. It would have only cost $100,000 to put cable under a road that was funded by the World Bank. And in Liberia, it would have connected major parts of Liberia before Ebola. And they didn't do it because it wasn't part of the mandate. And you know, it's a waste of money, right? Because now the development banks are going in and spending the money to promote connectivity, but it costs lives. I mean, the last lack of connectivity during the Ebola crisis was one of the reasons why so many people passed. So it's a challenge, and when it's one of those things where it actually doesn't cost that much money, because you could partner with the private sector to lay the cable because they're excited to save the money, and it wouldn't necessarily cost more taxpayer dollars. It requires effort of coordination into making it part of their mandate. So that's certainly one part of the things I think we should be thinking about in internet connectivity. On the actual tech part, there is a part of the USAID called the Global Development Lab that's looking at different technologically appropriate solutions and promoting innovation. So the grand challenges where they'll put out an award for people who come up with creative solutions to different challenges to try to promote that sort of innovation going forward. We're seeing a little bit more flexibility in procurements where people were asked for creative technological solutions to things, but we have a lot more to do, because right now I think tech, or like what we're seeing in California, is so far ahead of what people are doing in development that there's just this gap of the future. And also there's this challenge of the procurement cycle. So it takes people months and months and months to do a request for proposals to do a project. Then it takes a long time for all of the companies to respond with the proposal. Then it's more lag with the development agencies doing the review for the proposal. By the time you get to implementation, it's easily a year later, right? And like things have changed in the market, and different solutions are out there that you might not have known before. So I think we also need to start thinking about how to be a little bit more flexible in how we do procurement so that we can allow more innovation to pop up. So thanks. We have another question in the room.
Do you have any recommendations for how we might get people whose primary focus is business and not development excited about opportunities that could serve their enterprises but also help with development in that combination of business and aid?
So the question is, how do we get businesses more engaged or interested in international development? And so that was like exactly the question I had in '99 when I went to Berkeley, right? Like I was like, this is the space I care about, and especially with tech and development, and like I'm so interested. And I looked around in '99. It was obviously very different here. Like it was the height of the .com boom, and no one was thinking about those countries. They were really focused there, and I was like, I don't see it. Like it's just not happening. And so I thought I'd go to DC for a couple of years and come back. And then that didn't happen because 2 years after '99 was September 11th, and my job became really hot, and it just had so much meaning. I stayed, and now I'm still there. But it's something that's like happening slowly. You're hearing more and more companies getting interested because they see the business potential. I mean, you have a huge market in Nigeria or India, or so people are starting to see that there's market interest in it, and I think that will continue. I wonder if there's something to the internationalism at Berkeley, that you have the opportunity to interact with people from different countries and experience things through IBD, or the International Business Development course, to get more experience. I find it hard to, at least in my experience, to like bring people along from just a place of wanting to do good. It tends to have to be sort of connected to their business model for it to be like a sustainable engagement. But I guess the challenge is whatever people are doing, to think of past their circle, right? Like we're all in a circle of what we're doing now and who it impacts and what our current market is, but to think a couple layers out, to see where they might want to grow and what impact they might have to help the world. 95% of the world's consumers are outside US borders. And so if we think about, like, from the initial stage of creating a company, that the biggest part of the market is outside our borders, maybe we would structure things differently or reach out differently. There's a lot of organizations that are really enthusiastic about helping companies think about it. There's the US Global Leadership Coalition. That's a coalition of companies that care about development, that has a lot of great resources. There's Interaction, which is an association of nonprofits that also provides really great information. And then there's DevEx, DEVEX, which is a company that helps other companies and nonprofits in the international development space. They started out as a recruiter, and now are a news provider and an event coordinator, and they have great information about what's going on, and procurement opportunities, job opportunities, and just kind of market opportunities. So we have a question from Jean through Facebook. So the question is, due to the current administration, do you see overseas cooperative arms from other countries like Japan, England, the Dutch, the Australians, filling the gap for funding large international development projects? Or is this an old traditional way of doing international development? Private and individual donors seem to gravitate toward grassroots philanthropy overseas. So I don't see so first of all, we aren't expected to have a major funding gap from the US, though there was that budget, but the administration's budget request for FY18 was lower. We actually are seeing that we expect Congress to bring that up when we get to our final numbers. So we're not expecting a big number dip from the US. But, and we're not expecting the traditional international development donors to increase their funding. I think there's like a lot of economic uncertainty around the world. So we're not expecting the other bilateral donors to pop up international development. What we are seeing really is this opening for the private sector to go in. Now that it used to be that donor dollars were about 50% of the money that went to developing countries, and now we're at 90%. So that gap is really being filled by the donors. It's not always going to development projects where we would maximize impact, social impact or economic impact. The individual donors tend to not be focused as much on systems. They tend to pick a sector, and that's sort of challenging. I'm hoping that they will think more systemically, whether it's for domestic resource mobilization or health systems overall, or corruption and governance issues. rather than drilling down into things that are innovative and make for really great, compelling stories, but don't always change the discussion. We are seeing some donors that are the individual donors that are doing more than development impact. They're also trying to change the policy space. So we have the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, and Omidyar and others who actually have policy people that are trying to change the policy framework around their investments in development, which I think has a lot of potential for changing things. They certainly have in some of the projects that I've worked on. When I worked for the Senate, I worked for Senator Lugar, and we got through this legislation that required oil, gas, and mining companies to reveal their payments to governments. And this was a tool to combat corruption. If you look at countries like Libya or other resource-rich countries, they're supposed to have a lot of money, but the government, it's not in the government coffers. We did a report called the Petroleum and Poverty Paradox. We went to 17 different countries, and we saw that there were countries that, like Guinea-Bissau, that should have the per capita income of Belgium, but then we're absolutely poor. So we tried to figure out what was happening, and what we realized is that the companies were paying the government money, but no one knew how much, and money was getting stolen and never reaching the government to their budgets to help the people of those countries. So we wrote a bill that became law. It was an amendment to Dodd-Frank called the Cardin-Lugar Amendment that required oil, gas, and mining companies to reveal their payments to governments. It was this big transformative piece that we were really, really proud of. And it was embraced by the European Union. So now it is the rule of the EU that any companies listed on their exchanges also reveal their payments to oil, gas, and mining. It was embraced in Canada, Hong Kong, Australia. It kind of went global. So we're really, really excited about it. It was funded in part by the efforts to take it global were funded in part by some development donors, the private individual donors. And so it was this nice collaboration of like the US and the philanthropists kind of working together to promote policy. Unfortunately, in the United States, one of the first bills that President Trump signed was actually undoing that policy in the United States. So it's no longer the rule here, but it remains global. So even if a US company isn't required to do it, the disclosures through the SEC, it's still required to do that through the EU if they're operating in Europe, which many of the big companies are. So we've seen some sort of setbacks in that trend, but we are seeing more and more partnerships between kind of the traditional folks in development policy and the philanthropists out there. So we have a question here inside where mic is being handed over.
Yeah, so I have a question about how you think the role of social enterprise should play out in terms of actually. There's a more important question I think I want to ask. So going back to your point about the role of governments and the Guinea-Bissau example that you gave, I think that that's so much the case in many, many countries where you have a government that is not necessarily managing its resources appropriately, either intentionally or unintentionally. And in situations especially where there is a lot of corruption and it's just institutionalized. So for example, Haiti has had immense amounts of resources poured into the country for decades. And the development indicators have really not budged at all. And unless there's like a huge sea change, I think, in the political administration, and you get someone in the presidency who is truly committed to like raising all Haitians up instead of just continuing the status quo, which prioritizes like the upper class, and therefore they have no incentive to disrupt the system because they're doing just fine. How do you work with governments when there is sort of a political system in place that is not receptive to development? And I'm not saying that like democracy is the solution for every single country in the world, but I think you do need a stable political structure in order to like evolve in these other areas.
So the question is, how do we deal with development and governance issues in countries, some that are just bad performers, but some countries where there's just not the will to make big changes? So having spent time in Congress, what I realize about politicians is that their goal isn't to maximize policy benefits. Their goal is to get reelected. Like their goal is to stay in power. And so if we, like in business, you know, you're here to maximize profits, you know what you're going for. And if we always think about like how do we think they should be maximizing policy, and then we wonder why they're making these crazy decisions, it's really because they want to get reelected. So when we're thinking about developing countries, if they want to think about how do we maximize our influence, sometimes it's working directly with the government if they have the will to strengthen it so that we aren't putting money in a sieve, we're closing the holes. But sometimes it means we don't work with the governments, and we work with civil society, and we help people, we help create counterpoints and a constituency to push on the government to do differently. And that can be uncomfortable for traditional donors. That could be less uncomfortable for philanthropists. But I think we're in a stage where we do need to think a little bit more out of the box. So the Millennium Challenge Corporation was created to really do development differently. What it ended up doing was sending money through governments. But when we wrote the legislation, it's really short, it's just like 5 pages long. If you look at the actual bill, we didn't specify, that Congress didn't specify that it had to be money through governments. We thought we were creating a system where we would set out a goal and create competition between the private sector, civil society, and governments to come up with the best ideas to accomplish those goals. It just, in practice, it ended up being money to governments. So to think about using our existing tools like the MCC or being more flexible with aid money, to think about how to build up civil society to hold their governments to account. Maybe that's using tech, like helping people use accountability tools where they can see where their tax dollars are going, or tracking, the import of ministers' cars and, what types of, land, their land titling or whatever that is. Like there's a lot of tools now that we have to press transparency and accountability, because what we have seen in countries with bad governance is we have seen people rise up. And we have seen people push back and say, like, no, I don't want my country to be led like this. But what they do need is information, and they need tools. Because it's not just about ideas, it's about execution. And so maybe we should be thinking more about development financing and helping people in civil society develop those tools. So maybe that's teaching people how to lobby, teaching people how to message, teaching people how to write laws, teaching people like kind of the basic of civics of how things work and how you change them. Because I think that like in this moment of everyone being very expressive, people are really sharing how they feel, but they don't always know how to translate how they feel into actual political change. And I think that's true in the US as well as in the developing world. So, do we have one more question in the room? Yes, we do. Hold on.
One more from me. I'm curious on how you see the role of private companies in international development. One of the trends we're seeing in the Bay Area, and as you said, we're probably kind of years away from developing countries, but one of the trends we're seeing is that consumers are starting to put a huge importance on what companies are ethical or not. And that has translated into some companies doing high investments in developing countries. Is this a trend that you're seeing that could be possible, and how could we promote it more?
Oh, that's a great idea. So the question is, we're seeing here in the Bay Area that people care more about ethics and their companies, and so how do we use that to get them to be more engaged in development? So that is a fabulous question. And we have another Haas alumni who created Fair Trade, and it's like a stamp of approval that shows that people are trading fairly, paying workers fairly, applying labor laws correctly. And so maybe this is an opportunity to have someone step up and do something like that, where you're looking at having a logo or some sort of imprimatur that shows that this company is investing in development in a sustainable and progressive way that helps lift people. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think anyone's answered that question yet. We have a question from Amy through Facebook. How can individuals make the most positive development impact through philanthropy? So I think, wow, that's also a great question. I think that through philanthropy, if you're donating to an organization, to look at which ones are actually getting money to the ground, and thinking through which ones that resonate with your morals. There's certainly a lot of organizations that spend a lot of overhead, so to think through that. I think that one of the most important things that you can do on development impact is to think about what you're purchasing. Are you buying things from developing countries? Are you encouraging other retailers to procure things from developing countries, so that your commercial dollars are going to work? On the philanthropy side, so I'm tempted to give you suggestions of different groups that I've seen just do amazing work. There's so many of them that it's hard to it's like picking your favorite child. It's hard to do, but I think that it's like kind of picking a cause and then running with it. Whether it's so I'm just hesitant to name. So apologies for that. I just can't pick a favorite. So please, if you do have any questions, please reach out to me. I'm Nilmini Rubin at tetratech.com. We do a range of development projects, and so I'm happy to put people in touch with any of our team members that are working either on demining or countering violent extremism or water. We're all over, so I'm happy to do that or answer questions that folks might have on sort of the development process in Washington. It's certainly an exciting time to be doing this type of work, to be bridging our world, and it's a really important time that we don't build into our processes inequality, and that we really think about, as we rush to the future, that we're bringing the rest of the world along with us. So thank you.